I expect more from you. I know your parents. I heard phrases like that a lot growing up in a Christian private school as a missionary and pastor's kid in middle school. Sometimes it was, you should know better, or you're better than this. And to be fair, I understand where those expectations came from. My parents genuinely loved the Lord, and they served faithfully. I grew up around church, the ministry that they were a part of, and plenty of scripture and Christian education. People assumed those things naturally meant I was spiritually mature, even though I was a younger kid. The problem was, I wasn't there yet. I wanted to be. I wanted people to think highly of me, and honestly, part of me enjoyed the reputation that came with being the good Christian kid. But underneath the image was a middle school and high school student carrying pressure that I didn't know how to handle. So instead of learning how to grow spiritually in honest ways, I learned how to hide flaws in spiritually convincing ways. Research professor Brennan Brown talks a lot about how shame grows in environments where people feel they must appear perfect in order to be accepted. Looking back, I think that was part of what happened with me. I learned how to protect this image instead of honestly growing. And I think that's the danger of certain Christian environments, that they expect growth, but that sometimes expectations and assumptions can quietly replace genuine discipline with this unattainable image. Growing up in that environment, I felt like there was always this invisible standard hanging over me because of who my family was. The mistake I would usually make were not necessarily major things, but they often felt magnified. Teachers would call me out more quickly, expectations would rise higher, and there was this sense that I should already be spiritually mature simply because of the home I came from. And after a while, other students noticed that too. You begin feeling like people are watching you differently. You start carrying the pressure not of just being yourself, but of representing your family, your parents, and your faith, and all the expectations attached to that reputation. Again, I don't think all reputations or expectations of those reputations are bad, I should say. Expectations can encourage growth. Teachers in Christian schools have a difficult job because they are not only trying to educate students academically, but also help shape them spiritually. And so I don't want to discount that. But I think somewhere along the way, there can be a subtle shift from helping students grow spiritually to assuming certain students are already spiritually mature. And those are two very different things. Christian philosopher Dallas Willard once wrote that spiritual formation is a process, not a performance. Nobody becomes spiritually mature simply because they grow up around Christianity. Growth takes honesty, guidance, correction, and it really just takes time. What I needed most during those years was not lower standards, no. I needed guidance. I really just needed somebody to be patient with me, to be there with me. I needed room to be honest about where I was actually at spiritually, instead of feeling this pressure to appear further along than I actually was. Because when you are young and feel the pressure to maintain or create this image, honesty becomes difficult. For me, that looked like hiding struggles instead of confessing them, hiding sin instead of actually getting help with it, and trying to look spiritually put together while internally I was just feeling numb, isolated, and guilty. And the scary thing is, from the outside, it probably looked like everything was fine. Modern psychological research on perfectionism has found that environments with extremely high expectations often lead people to hide struggles instead of seeking the help because failure begins to feel dangerous rather than something that's actually helping them develop. That's what makes this kind of pressure so dangerous. It can teach people how to perform spiritually mature without actually developing spiritual maturity. I think this happens more often than we realize, especially in environments where Christianity is constantly surrounding the students. It becomes easy to know the right answers, say the right things, and maintain this right image that everybody's expecting while never actually being honest about your struggles or your questions. Research from the Barna Group has shown that many young Christians feel pressure to appear spiritually strong while privately struggling with doubt, anxiety, loneliness, or shame. I think there are more students carrying that tension than most people actually realize. And I don't think that just applies to pastors' kids or missionary kids like myself. I think there's students everywhere carrying expectations that they don't know how to handle. Especially in these Christian school settings, the good kid, the smart student or the athlete, the leader, in any setting, there's always pressure. But in this Christian atmosphere, I think what that pressure can lead to is a false sense of security. Psychologist Jean Twenge writes about how young people today are growing up under constant pressure to maintain an image of success and stability. And when internally they feel overwhelmed, it just becomes a breeding ground for more anxiety and more detrimental things for their mental health, and also just for the spiritual side, brings them further away. I think social media has also just amplified this so much and has just intensified the pressure. Sometimes the people who look the strongest externally are the people most afraid to admit that they're struggling internally. Looking back now, I realize my biggest frustration was never that people expected growth from me. The growth was good. I wanted the growth. And spiritual maturity was something that I wanted to pursue, and it was worth pursuing. The problem was that assumptions replaced the actual understanding. When people assumed I was spiritually healthy instead of actually helping me become spiritually healthy. And I think that's the most important difference there. Real spiritual growth usually does not happen through pressure to appear mature. It happens through honesty and just discipline. And it happens with correction in the right way, and definitely a growth that's just been brought out through somebody that is willing to listen and love and understand and correct and reproof. The theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer once wrote that real Christian community begins when people stop hiding from one another. I think that's true. I really do. Growth happens when people feel safe enough to be honest with their struggles. In our Holy Scriptures, it says that people look at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. And I think sometimes in these Christian environments, we unintentionally focus so much on the outward behavior that we forget what's happening internally. I think Christian schools, churches, and families do some of the best work when they create this appearance of success, but then when they do that, but when they create an environment safe enough for honest spiritual growth. Because students are still students, they're learning, and kids are still kids, they're gonna grow. And sometimes the young people who seem the most put together are actually carrying the heaviest pressures internally and struggling with the most. C.S. Lewis once said that Christianity is not simply about being or making people nicer, but making them new. But real transformation cannot happen when people feel like they have to hide who they are. So if there's one thing I want people to remember from my story, it's this. When expectations become more important than understanding, people stop learning how to grow spiritually and start learning how to hide spiritually. And when we truly care about someone's spiritual growth, we have to look beyond the image they present to take the time to understand who they really are. So I guess my challenge today would be, whether you're a teacher, pastor, parent, or even if you're the one struggling, do not just encourage people to look spiritually mature. Create spaces where they can actually honestly grow and be the people that they can come to and talk about the things that they're struggling with. Ask those deeper questions. Make room for their weaknesses. Reproof them, correct them when they do wrong. But don't assume that people who look strong are doing okay. Because when honesty becomes safe, growth becomes possible. Thank you.